Hi, I'm Alex,
I'm Annie.
and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And today we're going to wrap up our talks on resilience. We spent all of this month, September, talking about different papers about resilience. And we want to wrap this up by kind of questioning every single thing that we talked about this month, I think. Um, all these papers that we've talked about so far, they tried to do something with resilience, right? They wanted to either see what the consequences of resilience were, they wanted to see what the predictors of resilience were, things like that, right? But here, we want to kind of question what even is resilience? Like we were using this term so often, and like maybe we tried to do a little bit of that in our first week, but even then, like each of these papers, they do something a little bit different. When they call resilience something a little bit different, they define it a little bit differently, they measure it a little bit differently. So we want to spend some time on just that idea, and this is something that like psychologists always have to grapple with. We are dealing with subjective things, right? These ideas. Everyone has a slightly different idea of what things are, of like what happiness is, of what sadness is, of what a good relationship is, like all of these things, right? And so that also applies to resilience. And so we want to try to just like unpack some of that and maybe help you walk through some like the mind of a psychologist a little bit here. And you'll probably find that like even Annie and I won't even agree necessarily on what resilience is. Um, so this is something to always keep in mind as you like read these articles, or if you hear ever like reports on these papers. If someone's saying like, oh, this increases happiness, like maybe question, what do they even mean by happiness? If this increases resilience, what do they even mean by that? So um, maybe I'll just like start with this idea of what a construct is and what operationalization is. And I will
Oh,
try my
but
best.
maybe
Oh,
before,
oh yeah, go ahead.
sorry to cut you off, but maybe before that, like, should we kind of go through some of the definitions that were
Hmm.
used in the papers that we discussed? So I remember most recently, I
Mhm.
think last week, I think resilience was defined by the number of post-traumatic symptoms that like participants were experiencing 6 months after 9/11.
Mm.
And so in another paper, I think this paper was interesting to me because they defined resilience in a very broad way. So it was it could be any activities that were labeled as resilience in prior work. So this paper was a meta-analysis, I remember.
Mhm.
So, if a paper that was included in this meta-analysis defined resilience as being like, listening to music when you're, stressed or something like that, that all counted as resilience. And do you recall any other measure of resilience in our previous papers?
Yeah, I think in maybe even if this was in the first one, maybe they also said this in the second week of resilience, but it was something just like how well are you adapting to stress? Like that kind of idea is how they might
Mm,
define resilience. And so,
resilience.
right, and I mean that could be counted in so many different ways. Like I mean, there's so much subjectivity in so many different parts of that. Like what is adaptive? What is stress? Like all of that, right? So um,
Mm.
I think, yeah, that's basically the two different, or three different ways that they tried to look at this. And so, if you ever hear the word like operationalization, that's kind of what we're talking about here. That this is
Mm.
how people define the construct of interest. The construct of interest here is resilience. The way that it's operationalized is, let's say, PTSD symptoms, and the amount of that. Or it could be literally other researchers have labeled this resilience. So we are also now going to use this term. And in that case, that was like music therapy, or that was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that,
Mm.
which And those are very different, but here we are. We're calling them the same
But
thing.
they are, included in the umbrella term of resilience. So, I think this, very much explains like how it is very tricky and difficult to operationalize a psychological term, because perhaps, the same thing could mean so many different things for different people, right?
Mhm.
So, but it is something that psychologists do, work with, like in everyday research practices, like how we define and operationalize subjective terms in
Mhm.
very concrete, constructs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's up to us to make it as concrete as possible. Because I mean, psychology, like, I guess to some degree, like it's visual and you can like see it and like you can quantify it, but like also not really, right? Like it's so many different things. So it's up to us to figure out what is it that we actually are counting, what is it that we're actually measuring. Um, and I mean, sometimes I'll maybe just like say this and maybe we can come back to this idea, but like if you ever see that there's two papers that end up like finding different conclusions, it potentially is because of like this operationalization. Like they literally
Mm.
just defined the term a little bit differently and they found different effects. Like these kinds of things happen all the time and it's super confusing. It's not only for researchers, but also like for the general public, right? So yeah, it's up to us as researchers to like do a better job of really defining things. And like, I mean, we can like sit back and like think about this for a little bit, but like, I don't know if that necessarily happens. We don't necessarily have these discussions across researchers. Like, hey, like let's agree that this is actually what this thing is. But I mean, maybe those conversations would help quite a bit. So maybe that's maybe where I want to start. Actually, let's take some of the science out of this, and let's just say like what for you, like if you had like this ideal picture of resilience, what would be in that measurement there? Like, what are some things that you would be looking for if you wanted to measure this?
I think at least, among the measures that we talked about, the one measure and definition that resonated with me the most, like based on my personal experience and how I think about resilience, is the ability to carry on,
Mm,
despite, external stresses and like whatever really stressful events that you are experiencing. For
mhm,
example, there are some, part of me that's like that I think as being like my core self.
mhm,
Like, for example, like my everyday habits and the person that I interacted with every day. So, like these like stable things that define me,
mm,
um, is if, I am able to carry on with these things, even though like I might be experiencing severe stress and so forth. And even though, like I think it's really difficult to carry on with your normal, like everyday habits when you are experiencing severe stress. But
mhm,
if you are able to come back to this, come back to your core self,
mhm,
I think that kind of like ability to be continue being yourself, either by your daily activity and in your social interactions. To me, that's how I would define resilience personally.
mhm.
But for you, like, when you think of yourself, like, what kind of situations would you imagine if you think of yourself being resilient?
Um, so yeah, I guess to me, like there has to be some sort of like stress beforehand. So like, do I know I'm resilient if there's never anything that's stressful? And like, I don't know if I
Mm,
would be able to figure that out. Um, but I mean, great life, right? If that was actually the case. But um, when it comes to resilience, yeah, I mean, resilience to me is like it's really in the everyday. Like it's of course there's these super major traumatic kind of events, but like like literally so many bad things happen a day, so many bad things that you could perceive, like and you could like be bogged down by, and like things like that, right? Like, oh, my computer is not turning on correctly, like but like I persevere, and I try to figure out a way to turn it on, or like I do something else in the meantime, or whatever, right? Like all these other ideas like help adapt to the situation. Or it could be like bigger things, right? Like maybe I misplaced my wallet and like that would suck. But like, what do I do after that, right? And do I sit there and like, do I end up like being overtaken by like negative emotions, or like do I try to get back to like, hey, like I'm gonna be okay, like I can figure this out, and move on, kind of thing. So I mean, yeah, I think there's this idea of just like everyday resilience that like I think gets passed over quite a bit. And I mean, obviously that didn't happen like in our current papers. This idea of like everyday resilience. These were usually like pretty big kinds of things. But yeah, that's kind of what I think about. I also think about like if I were to like figure out actual people in history that like are resilient, right? Like we can point to people that hopefully we can all agree on. Although actually, there's plenty of people that would disagree on some of these people. So uh, there's some fictional characters that I will mention, like Mulan. If you are familiar with the story, I mean, I guess Mulan was a real person, right? But I mean, who knows about her actual story? Um, but yeah, she was super resilient, right? Like so everyone told her, no, she can't do anything, but like here she did. She saved China, basically, right?
But you know, if you're going to count Mulan, I would guess like every character in Disney movies are
Mm.
resilient. They always overcome challenges, don't they? Um,
Potentially. Oh man, there's gonna be so many. I don't know. I don't know if I would agree with that. Because like there's like the idea of like a damsel in distress sort of thing, right? And like, I mean, maybe at the end of the day they're happy, but like I don't know. This is a horrible discussion for
okay,
me putting
let's
here.
not get into this.
There's a lot that
Discussing
goes
about
on.
the whole Disney story plots.
There's a lot of sexist things that happen in Disney movies, although they've
Oh yeah,
helping
yeah.
break out of that. But okay, so then other fictional characters. There's Gandalf. I think if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings,
Hmm.
he is super resilient. He literally died and came back to life, and he continued to help Frodo on his journey. So I think that's resilient. But then there's real life humans too that we could look up to, and like in our like contemporaneous like life. There are people like Malala Yousafzai. There are people like Anita Hill. There's Christine Blasey Ford. There's Serena Williams. There's Simone Biles. There's all these people that we could look to that are quite resilient, right? Like there's so much stress that they're undergoing, but they continue to, at least if not only present themselves, actually feel like they are good, like they are doing well, like they are
Able to get through it. Yeah.
right. Exactly. Are there other people you
This
want to?
brings
Yeah,
oh, no, I don't know enough
yeah.
characters, but but like this brings me to a question where, you know, like there are different manifestations of resilience. Like,
Mm,
for example, I think there are at least that two that you talked about. So, I mean, two that we both talked about. One is really the resilience that's like shown, like how much you
mm,
are carrying on with your daily activities and like how much you are still being able to interact with others. But then there's really internal one, like psychological one,
mm,
like how much you think that you are able to get through this. So I think these are related, but then they are also separate, like in the
right.
sense that even though you're not adaptable, like behaviorally right now, like if you have a strong belief that you can get through this, maybe, you know, that will produce a behavioral resilience, like in the long term too.
Hmm.
So yeah, so what do you think about this?
Yeah,
point.
no, I definitely I think that's such a good thing that you brought up because I don't think your internal like sense of self always matches up with like how you present yourself, right?
Mm,
You could be very much doubting yourself on the inside. You could be like feeling a lot of anxiety about like certain things, but like on the outside, you might be like smiling and like helping other people like in their lives and like things like that, right? And so you look very resilient, but then maybe you go back home and you're just like completely burnt out and you can't like function, right?
mm,
So I think that's something that definitely needs to be talked about. I don't know if we all do a good job of talking about that here, but I think because it brings up the idea of like how do you measure this, right? So like, do you measure just the
mm,
behavioral aspects? Do you measure just like the self-report aspects? And I think to some degree they're both valid. But I mean, there's no
mm.
answer to this question, but like, what wins out at the end of the day? I don't know.
Yeah. But at least when measuring resilience, like I think other people's perceptions about like whether someone is resilient or not, I think that personally, I think that's like the least credible way of measuring resilience.
Hmm.
It's just because the reason that you just talked about, like,
Hmm.
people do need to put up their social faces, like in their jobs and so forth. So even though they're tearing apart, like internally, oftentimes we are definitely pressured to, don't appear that way,
Hmm.
like outside.
Hmm.
So just because resilient is very personal, like construct and very subjective construct,
Hmm.
I am, skeptical of whether measuring resilience through other people's evaluation is a great reflection of what's actually going on. One
Hmm.
opinion, though,
Hmm.
you don't need to agree.
I like half agree with that. Because I do think there is a place for like these perceptions of others on you.
Mm,
And sometimes, so there are certain things that like other people can actually perceive better than yourself. We often like have ideas of ourselves and like we think we are these things. But like other people can see like let's say you are like very motivated like person, right? And you are always like doing everything to like perfection and like things like that, right? But then other people around you, they see like, oh, like that person actually like they look very tired, they look very worn out, they look like they're about to like crack
mm,
basically, right? But like in that other person's head, like they feel like, oh, like I'm fine, like I'm accomplishing all these things, like I must be doing well. But like from the outsider's perspective, they're like, no, like you need to take a break. Like you can't keep doing this for the rest of your
mm,
life. So I think there is like some validity there to this like person perception sort of thing. But then on the other side, there's like, I mean, people are like, they can only do it based off the cues that you give them, right? So like if people are like faking it and they do a good job of that, then like, I mean, they can't know what's going on inside aside from that, right? Um, so yeah,
yeah, I think that's a really great point. Yeah, it's a point that I was, missing sometimes. Yeah, other people do, especially those who are close to you and
mm,
you interact with more frequently, they catch very subtle cues that you might not be aware of.
mm.
So yeah, I
Uh,
think you made a good point there.
this is also backed up in research, so this isn't just my opinion. I don't want to say
Oh, okay. So I was completely incorrect then.
no, so you're not incorrect because both of those are true, right? People are both good and bad
Mm,
at perceiving.
yeah,
It just
others.
it just depends on what the actual thing is, and I don't want to say what
Mm,
those things are because I can't remember off the top of my head, but I do know that it is true. Some things other people can perceive better, some things you can perceive better. Um,
mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
I mean, self-perception and other perception, they're not always perfect
mhm,
so yeah.
right, both sides are flawed. um, So, I mean, for me, then, like, the idea that you can really measure something just by having one measurement of it. So, if you only do self report, if you only do informant report, if you only do physiological things, if you only do behavioral things, right? Like, all these things, like, they're usually less compelling to me than if you are doing like a mixed method sort of thing, than like if you're doing self-report and physio, if you're doing self-report and behavioral, right? Like if you have these other things to like help, like, oh, there's like I see this here and I also see this here, and like like it's helps support the idea like, oh, this is actually a resilient person. This isn't just a resilient person in their own head. This is a resilient person like in all these other like facets. So that's usually like where I land on.
No, yeah, I totally agree with your point. And even in research, like particularly for concepts like resilience, which is very broad,
Mhm.
like you if you really want to establish, some finding, then you would probably want to try out like maybe not different definitions, but at least, different ways of measuring resilience, to, see if the effects are really true. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with this, but I don't think psychologists do this. And maybe I'm
Yeah.
not supposed to say that, but like also it's true, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty
So
rare that.
sometimes,
Go ahead.
yeah, and because of that, I think sometimes like it's really our job, like as individuals in academia, like if you want to figure out something, because different papers, you use different operationalizations and different constructs to measure the same thing. We really have often have to kind of read through all these papers to come to a conclusion, right? You can't come to a conclusion just by reading one paper that defined resilience in a certain way. I mean, that was the benefit of discussing 4 papers about resilience,
Mhm.
this month, because we really don't know just by reading one paper.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No one paper will ever give you all the results that you need. And I mean, things are also changing, right? Like there's different circumstances in which like resilience maybe should be defined a certain way versus like
Mm,
a different way. And yeah, I mean, all of those changes matter to some degree. But I do think that there could be a better job with research and just like help coming together to actually define things and like, oh, these are actually the set of like measures that like get at like all the different like aspects here or something like that, right? Um, but that doesn't happen. It's usually like one lab kind of like has like domain over it, right? Like they are the people that created the construct and
yeah.
the measurement, and so everyone else
And
uses
everybody
it,
just, yeah,
right?
yeah, true. Without doubt. No, I think that's true.
So maybe before we continue this, I want to talk a little bit about like the actual other measures that are out there. So we talked a little bit about like different ways to define it and like a couple of ways that people have measured it. But there's plenty other scales out there, and usually scales are like it's a little bit easier to like maybe comprehend. Like, oh, you fill out this questionnaire, you have an answer at the end of it, but what does that answer actually give you, right? So there's different resilience scales out there. This Connor Davidson resilience scale.
Resilience scale.
Yeah, they have 25 items for their scale, but there's also like a shorter one just in case you don't have the time or the space to like actually do that. Which actually that's gonna be a whole other podcast episode talk about like actual methodology, like and how to decide those kinds of things. But there are these different versions out there. Some questions that were on both the full and the brief version of this were things like, are you able to adapt to change? Do you try to see the humorous side of problems? Are you not easily discouraged by failure? Can you handle unpleasant feelings? Can you achieve goals despite obstacles? Can you coping with stress can strengthen me. So these kinds of ideas. So there's a lot of different things that I just said here. Maybe let's focus on a couple of these to see like, do you actually agree? Like, is this resilience? This first one, able to adapt to change. What do you think? Is that resilience to you?
I mean, like, I think you selected an appropriate measure, particularly because, some things that appear in that items, like ability to adapt to change and being able to think that coping with stress, is something that they can, help them like in the long term and not easily being discouraged by failures. These are some things that we just talked about, like about like how we think of resilience.
Mhm.
So I think, this scale to some extent does a good job of trying to incorporate like all these different interpretations about resilience in their skill. What do you think?
Yeah, so I do think I think most of the items here are very good. And they're the exact things that we just discussed. But then there's some that like make me really question like what are we getting here? So maybe I'll first say the item tries to see the humor side of problems.
Yeah, I expected you to choose that.
So I think yes, of course, that would well, actually no, I even like walk that back a little bit. I think that could potentially show resilience, right? That could potentially be a measure that like you can like reframe things, right, and make them a little bit more positive than negative. But the idea of like using humor, that could also very much like suppress things. That could very much like not actually allow you to deal with things, right? Like it's like it's not always the best.
It could
like
be a
coping.
form of avoidance.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I would call someone that is actively avoiding like the issue in front of them as like, are you resilient or not? Like, I don't know. So there's like that sort of thing. And then there's also like humor. I don't know, humor in general, like it's like not everyone does it, right? Like some people do, some people don't, right? So it's not like this like ubiquitous thing. So it's hard for me to like get on board with like this item. And so if someone, let's say,
you question whether this applies to everybody.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Because people could say no to this or like rate it like lowly on the scale, and that would like affect like the rest of their like the average score that they get, right? Like that's going to drop it down. And it's like, well, I mean, this person's actually very resilient, but they just don't use humor.
No, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so it's tough for me. But I would say, I mean, obviously, a lot of people use the scale. This is one. So the ones that I'm going to talk about here, like these are all ones that a lot of people use. But even then, it's like I still have questions about them. So it's like, should we be making something better? And I don't know. Maybe there isn't anything better. Maybe they really had like good reasoning to like incorporate like humor, like other things into this. But yeah, it's maybe not for us to decide either, right? Like you as an audience, like you should also like weigh in on this, right? Like, what do you think? Like maybe I'm just wrong about this, and maybe humor really
and
is
maybe
important.
there are items that are missing here. That's actually really important, right? And we really don't know because these are just established skills that researchers use without really questioning. So.
Yes, and I mean honestly, I think that happens often. That like you're gonna have missing items, and sometimes researchers will like kind of just make up items and like try to add them, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, it happens a lot. So okay. That is one scale. This is another scale. So the Connor-Davidson resilience scale, that is primarily used for adults. Other people have tried to create a measure for children, or at least younger people. And so what they did here, I mean, completely different, I would say. They
Wow,
yeah, they have like different factors here. So they have the individual resilience, they have relational resilience, and they have contextual resilience. Connor-Davidson scale does not do any of this necessarily. Like potentially you could do a little bit of that, but like it's not meant to. So this other scale, it has 28 questions. I think there's also a brief version of this, but the 28 one is used pretty widely. And so let me just read some of these and maybe we can try to decide like, is this individual? Is this relational? Is this contextual? Does that distinguish, does it matter to even distinguish them? So I cooperate with people around me. I aim to finish what I start. People think I am fun to be with. My caregivers watch me closely. I enjoy my caregivers' cultural and family traditions. Spiritual beliefs are a source of support for me, and I am proud of my citizenship. So there's, we went through a lot of different topics here. How does this like compare to the Connor-Davidson for you? Like, is this any more or less valid in your head for getting that resilience?
I think one distinction definitely is like for the Connor Davidson, which is targeted at adults, these are more really about like themselves, right? Like, how are you feeling and what are you doing? But I think we talked about this at some point before in our podcast where, because, children, because they're underage, like they are naturally more dependent, like with on others around them. So I'm guessing that's why the items, like there are definitely more items that's about like relational things, like for example, I cooperate with people around me and how other people think about them, like people think I'm fun to be with. So like there are much more interpersonal and like social aspects, and perhaps that's much more important in terms of like defining resilience for young kids.
I definitely hear that point. And although I think it's true, I also think it's true that like as adults, we still need people, right? Like it's not that like we're just able to do everything on our own. And like we've also seen that in like previous results that like something like high social support, right? Exactly. So like shouldn't that be included like in a valid measure? Like shouldn't we like also focus on that since we know it's like such an important like part of resilience? It's not just a you thing.
Yeah. And if you think it in a in the opposite direction, like shouldn't is it okay that we also assume that like resilience for children is really about how they relate to others? Maybe they already know how they're dealing with problems, and maybe they already have some metacognition about themselves, and why don't we incorporate that into resilience skills for children as well? So I think there are definitely aspects that could be improved in both skills.
Right.
But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that I'm trying to what did what did you just say? Like how can I reframe that? The idea that like children can on their own be resilient, right? Like there are so many children that like unfortunately have such like bad circumstances where they don't have people that they can turn to, but they are very resilient people, right? They continue like going to school, they continue learning, they continue making friends if possible. But not always, right? Like there's a lot of like broken families that like the children kind of just have to like fend for themselves. But they're not resilient. I mean, and often they're more resilient than a lot of other people, but they don't necessarily have like the relational like sort of stuff, right? So I mean, yeah, it's a hard thing to really like know like what do you do with that?
Yeah, and I think my another point was that it could be possible that children also have some sense of how resilient they are. So like you can, as you can see, like the items that you mentioned for children's measure of resilience, like they are much more indirect.
Right.
So none of them ask about like, are you comfortable with change? Like, do you think you'll be okay if people like stress you out? Like there are really no questions that's like directly gets at like how children cope with stress. So I think that was one limitation that I mentioned for these kind of children targeted skills.
Yeah, no, and I think that's such a good point, that it is super indirect. So like it's almost like fully dependent. Like if your circumstances are good, then you are also resilient. But if your circumstances aren't good, then like you're not resilient.
You're not resilient, yeah.
And I don't agree with that. Like I keep looking at this one item in particular. Like I am proud of my citizenship. I think that is such a great thing. I'm sure that people that are proud of their citizenship are much more resilient, but also like you don't necessarily need that, I think, in order to be resilient, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And there's always the argument that like this is just one item, right? So like it could be fine, like it's not going to make that big of a difference. But I think, I don't know, we have these imperfect measurements and then we try to make like these bold conclusions based off of them, right? It's
Mm.
there's definitely a mismatch.
And also, one reason that researchers need to be really careful about like the items that's included in a skill is that, one answering one item can influence people's responses to other items as well,
Mm,
right? So let's say, you ask about citizenship out of nowhere, then, that definitely, makes children think about what it means for them, and that kind of thought processes can definitely spill over to how they answer other items.
hmm
So it's not like, oh, this item is just one item, it's not going to have an effect. It has more effect than we might think.
hmm
So
Right.
skills are very difficult to develop.
Yes. No, very
I
different.
mean, good skills. Yeah, good skills are difficult to develop.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to think of questions, but then when you really think about it, it's like, oh, I actually did mess that up. Whether that is
Mm,
ordering or whether that is like, this is not a good
mm,
question to like actually get at the construct. Um, yeah, no, I definitely hear that point. I think, thank you for saying that, because I wasn't thinking about the ordering at all. But like, if you are thinking about citizenship and then you think about like, oh, like I don't know what it means to like even be a citizen, and like now you're like wondering like, am I actually supported in the way that I am? Are my circumstances like actually as good as I thought? Like, yeah, totally, that could have an effect.
yeah, that brings a whole lot of different things. Like, yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
so we're out of time, but I do want to,
Already.
right? Yes, we could definitely keep going on this. But and I think we will. I think we'll continue like incorporating this idea of just like measurement, at least maybe once a week, for like any of these big topics that we do, because it's important, right? And it's not something that like
Mm.
researchers are necessarily transparent about, and it's not necessarily written up like through the media and like things like that. Um, yeah, we want to do stuff like this, as long as it's useful to you, and like do let us know if you like this discussion. But before I end this, any last thoughts on anything?
Oh, I think we kind of talked about it like before the actual recording, but like
Mm,
resilience. I mean, you already brought up a good point where we have different skills
mm,
that's particularly measuring resilience for adults, but also like children.
mm,
But like resilience can also mean different things across different time, across different era.
mm,
What people defined, how people defined resilience in 90s could like completely be different from how we think of resilience now,
mm,
because there are so much things happening very rapidly,
mm.
and that's something that we should also care about as researchers, but we don't as much. So maybe one last point that I can bring up is that.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'll add on quickly to that, because it's a super important point that, I mean, these psychological constructs, they change over time. And so maybe our measurements should also change across time, like alongside with them, right? What it means to be proud of your citizenship. That that definitely has changed in the past 20 years, compared to like
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
the like, yeah, 1950s or something, right? And but like that's absolutely the case that we still use measurements that were like developed back then.
Mm,
Luckily for these resilience skills, these the latest that is like widely used that I know of, I think it might actually be this Connor Davidson scale that was in the 90s. But like for other kinds of things, like when it comes to like social support, like I know there's definitely things that are done in the 70s and 80s that like we still use today. And like I think our idea of like what social support means like has also changed like as a society. So like
mm,
it would be great if we could develop new measurements, but like that also takes a lot of time, right? If you really
A
want
lot of time, yeah.
to, if you really want to get at, to make like a good measurement, like that's going to take quite a bit of time to develop, and like people just want to like run their own studies already. Like they don't want to have to sit like take that time to create the measurement to then do the study, right? Like that's going to take like an additional like 3-4 years like to do all of those things for every single study. Like science is slow enough already.
Yeah, but at least, thankfully, there are definitely some really motivated researchers where new scale is developed. Like some researchers like continue testing that scale through, even though they may not be the original inventors. They continue testing the scale across different populations so that they can suggest like refinement. So, that kind of process does exist in academia so that we know that we are making some skills better.
Right.
But it doesn't happen always.
Right. And yeah, no, I think that's definitely it's much more common practice for at least people to report like a little bit more about like, oh, like this actually was a reliable like sort of thing in our sample, and like there's people that like start to collect that like data and like say like, oh, like this across time this has been like holding up, and like that's great. There's so much more I want to say on this, but we're going to end this for today. Maybe the last point I'm going to say on this is, even though we have been talking about how shaky this idea is of measurement, this does not completely like wipe out the all the other like evidence that we've said so far, all the other like conclusions that we've said so far. It potentially could, of course, and I think I kind of just like bring this up for the sake of like discussion. It's up to you to decide, like, does this still like hold now that you know all this stuff about like measurement, and now that you know all this stuff about like what resilience is. And I mean, personally, I still agree with like the conclusions that have come largely, and not necessarily every single one, but largely, I still agree with a lot of things. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, these papers are still definitions of resilience. Like it's just different across papers, and we should be able to think, we should be able to integrate like, what we talked about, what we read. So obviously, just because there are different measures of resilience, that doesn't mean one measure is wrong or incorrect or etc. So
sometimes I think that there are sometimes wrong.
Yes. Yeah. I will never be conclusive.
Right.
There is definitely an open question to that. Yes. Yeah.
All right, so yeah, I mean, I hope you all enjoyed this. Like I definitely enjoyed this stuff. So if this is enjoyable to you, we will keep doing this, but we'll try this out a couple more times and see how it goes. All right, so that's it for today. Finally, next finally, yeah. Hopefully, I mean, yeah. But next month we're going to be switching topics. I haven't decided exactly what this topic's going to be just yet. So if there are ideas out there, like we're open to suggestions. But in the meantime, again, I'll just shortly plug the website, roomforresearch.com, which holds all of our content, as well as our social media at Room for Research. And yeah, feel free to check out all these other things that we're creating on the topic of resilience and all the other topics that we're also have been talking about. Until next week. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
The sun will breathe.